I want Mark just to give you, he did a wonderful job on the freshman webinar. We did a webinar several weeks ago for freshman legislators across the country to introduce them to COS. And he did a phenomenal job really laying out the heart of COS in a very succinct, logical fashion. So I'd like you to kind of do the COS 101 for us first.
Okay, great. First, I want to say how great it is to be here. We sort of have, Christmas, New Year's, off-season, quote unquote, and things slow down. Y'all didn't slow down, but I did slow down a little bit. And for me, to get back out in the field is really exciting. Sometimes I get tired of traveling. I was telling Patty last night, getting ready to go and packing up, and just how excited I was to get back out. And the reason I say that is because being with the grassroots, being in a room full of people like y'all, is the reason that I do what I do. I mean, literally, it's because I have so much faith in you. I've traveled so much around the country. I know so many of you. I know we're going to save the country because you're out there. So one, just thank you guys for being here because you guys give me the juice that I need. I appreciate it. Number two is you guys are actually seeing something historic, which is, Mike Ferris and I founded this organization together. It was his idea, and he brought me in, and we joined hands, founded the organization, started to build this organization together. So after years away at ADF doing incredibly important work, Mike called me a few months back and asked if there was still a home for him here. I said yes. So you guys are seeing the first time out on the road, me and Mike Ferris together again. The band is back together. So I'm especially excited to be here. Now, I know a lot of you know the basics of COS, but I think it's important for those who don't, and also for all of us who do, that we just kind of constantly refresh exactly what it's about and why we do what we do. And I'm going to tell you something that Mike Ferris told me when we got on the phone that first time and we started talking about this idea. He asked me a question. He asked if I was satisfied with what I'd accomplished in politics. And my answer was no, I'm miserable. And the reason I was miserable is we had elected the largest swing class in the history of Congress since 1938. The Tea Party movement was responsible for that. And then they went into Washington, D.C., and I thought everything was going to change, and they promptly did nothing, right? Literally nothing changed. And Mike told me that it was because I had a mistaken impression of what it would take to fix the system and what was actually wrong. And Mike explained to me that we had a systemic problem, a structural problem, not a personnel problem in Washington, D.C. And what we've done over the last, say, 120 years, 125 years now maybe, is we've broken our system of governance. And the founders gave us a way to fix it if that ever happened. Colonel George Mason said, September 15, 1787, that he asked a question of the men assembled there who were drafting the Constitution. The convention's almost over. He said, we have a problem. We haven't given the power to the states to propose amendments. We gave it to Congress. Are we so naive that we believe that a Congress that becomes a tyranny will ever propose the proper kinds of amendments to fix their own tyranny? And of course the answer to that is no, because that's not human nature. I'm not aware of any human being ever that said, hey, I have too much power, I need to give it back to other people. It's just not the way people are wired. And so he knew, and they, without debate, voted unanimously to give us this power, to call a convention of states, to propose amendments to restrain the federal government. That was one of the purposes that they were proposing this for. So here we are now, almost 250 years later. We have not used the second clause of Article V, and the federal government is clearly out of control. Originally, a very limited number of enumerated powers given to the federal government, limited enumerated powers, those to the people in the states, unenumerated and unlimited. And yet the federal government now has all the power. I think there were 17 original enumerated powers. Today, I think the federal government has 17 million or so. I don't really know how many, but it's a lot. And so it's broken and it's backwards, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of court cases we could discuss, or the 17th Amendment. A lot of things have happened to break the structure, but the founders told us what to do if it ever got to this point, and we had an unresponsive federal government. And they said, call a convention, propose amendments, and go through the process. And the process that they laid out for us goes like this. It takes 2/3 of states to call a convention of states. Today that's 34 states. The process is that each state drafts and then passes a resolution, generally by a simple majority in both houses. The governor's signature is not necessary. This is not a bill. It's not legislation. It's important to remember that distinction. This is called a resolution. So it's no involvement of the governors, no governor's signature necessary. Just got to get the House and the Senate to do it. Once they do that and they pass a resolution, that resolution is transmitted to Congress for recording. And when we get to the point where there are 34 states that have passed virtually identical resolutions, then Congress has a duty, and it says in the Constitution that they shall call a convention, and that means they should name the time and the place. This is really important. It says shall. That means they have no discretion. This is what's legally called either a ministerial or a secretarial duty. They have to do this. And I just want to assure people, I get asked the question all the time, what happens if they don't? And the answer is it doesn't actually matter, in my opinion, in our legal opinion, because the states retain the sovereign authority to gather anytime they want. States are sovereign entities. It is, and this is an important thing to remember, a convention of states. It's not a convention of delegates. It's not a convention of proportional representation. It's not a convention of people or populations. It is a convention of states, the sovereign states gathering. When the states gather, they'll gather in convention. They will elect their own officers at convention. If you want to know what this looks like, we ran a simulated convention in 2016. Much of the footage from that is on the web. They'll elect their officers. They will adopt a set of rules. Likely those rules will be Mason's rules. Mason's rules are used by about 70% of the state legislatures in the country. We believe that most of the delegates to convention will be legislators or retired legislators, so they'll use something they're familiar with. If you're not familiar with Mason's rules, they're like Robert's Rules of Order. Some of the legislatures actually use Robert's rules. So they'll draft their rules, probably using that rule set. By the way, we've prepared a model rule set that makes it easier for them to give them something to start on. They'll layer over a couple of particular rules on Masons that'll be things particular to convention. And then likely the way they'll operate is like a legislature. You guys, most of you have watched a legislature operate. You understand that they'll probably break out into committees around the 3 subject matter areas of our resolution. The resolution has 3 subject matter areas: anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, like a balanced budget, tax and spending caps, things like that. Anything that would impose term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. And it's important, notice I said federal officials and members of Congress, because it could apply as well to staffers and bureaucrats, what we now know as the deep state. And I think this is important to understand. Yeah, everybody thinks about term limits for Congress, but it's important on the rest of the critters there in DC too. And then finally, anything that would impose what we call scope and jurisdictional restrictions on the federal government. That's essentially telling the government, no, you can't do this stuff. For example, you can't be involved in education or energy or healthcare or the environment or a myriad of things that they were never intended to be involved in. So committees will discuss this. They'll probably break out into subcommittees as well, much like your legislature does. When they agree on a proposed amendment, they'll bring it back to the floor of the convention, what they call the committee of the whole. Technically speaking, they'll debate it, they'll amend the proposed amendment until they get one that the majority of states can agree upon. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 5. They will then send that out to the states for ratification. The process of ratification is the same as if the amendment came out of Congress. It takes 38 states or 3/4 of states to ratify any amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution. So that's the general process, and I want to add one last thing to this that I think is really important. People ask me, well, what happens if they get into convention and they can't come to any conclusion? They can't actually propose an amendment. And that's possible, by the way. In fact, that's the outcome probably that if I worry about it at all, that would be the one I worry about most. People talk about a runaway convention. We can talk about that later. I don't worry about that one at all. I worry about, like, if they get there, can they actually decide on anything? And my answer to that is, so that, if you think about it, in essence, you could say, well, maybe that's what failure looks like. And if that's what failure looks like, I'm happy with that, because what will happen in the process is we will have built, and we have built now, the largest self-governing grassroots army in American history, and we need that army, and you're part of that army. We need it for a lot of reasons. And we will have conducted the largest constitutional education project in American history, a project where the American people are paying attention to a discussion that fundamentally asks the question, who decides? You and the states, or the federal government? And I think that's a very important discussion to have regardless of the outcome.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, just to build on that a little bit, one of our key sponsors in the House has been with us from the beginning. Dennis Rydell often talks about that point, that even if we don't get any amendments out of the convention, just the process of going through that, educating us, educating ourselves, educating our kids, our colleagues, our friends, our politicians. Do not assume your House or Senator understands the Constitution. Actually, probably most of them don't. So it's up to us to educate them, and this is a big part of what Mark was talking about.